I was looking at some numbers the other day and I found them to be fascinating. I think it was about $1.2 trillion in actual cost of the economy was added by Obama regulations, another 35 billion added by Trump, and then somewhere about $1.3 trillion added on top of that by Biden. If you actually could reduce regulations, there's some easing that I would think that would happen that would allow us to grow the economy faster.
In the CPI, about almost a third is housing. And in the personal consumption expenditure index, it's about 16% that's housing. Given the shortage of housing and increasing prices and increasing costs of building a house, largely regulatory, we're stuck.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and dissectate and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody back to New Frontiers. And let me start with our two regular panelists. First, Bob Robb, who is a syndicated columnist. He's one of my favorite writers, conservative, but always is willing to talk about ideas and issues from a different slant. Bob, welcome back to New Frontiers.
Great to be with you again.
And then for 40 some years, my favorite economist, Elliot Pollack. I like calling him the Oracle just because he's over and again kind of guessed things correctly in terms of where they're going. He has a very good private firm here in Arizona, but he's also good at taking a look at these issues and helping us out understand what's happening in the markets. Elliot, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right, so Elliot, I want to start today with the bond markets. I'm fascinated about what is happening with the bond markets today. The fact that the Feds have been intentionally lowering rates, and at the exact same time, almost to the exact same percentage, the bond markets have been increasing rates. There are a couple of things that are fascinating about that to me. One of them is, obviously, there's a direct connection between corporations and government being able to finance and refinance their debt, and the bond markets going up, or the 10-year bonds going up, have a negative effect on them. It also seems to have some effect on housing mortgages. But if you could help us understand the bond market a little bit better, and maybe give us your analysis of why you think the bond market is going up while the Fed rate is going down.
Yeah, the bond market is a huge market. It's not only governments that finance their debt, but it's corporations that finance their debt, and especially mortgage-backed securities. Without the bond market, the economy couldn't function. But the bond market relates to interest rates. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. When interest rates go down, bond prices go up. And that's because the yield, or the what you get in terms of interest, is fixed. And so if rates go up, basically it takes less money to get a yield that the market wants. So what happened is the general expectation was, for several months before Trump got elected, that the Fed was on the right track and they were going to be able to bring inflation down. And that affects long-term bond prices. Short-term bond prices are really affected by what the Fed does. They control short-term rates. When you get out past a year, and certainly 5-year and 10-year and 30-year, that really is a function of the marketplace and people's expectations of inflation. Why inflation? Because essentially what you buy when you buy a bond is a yield, and that yield is made up of a inflation premium and a real rate of return. In other words, if the bond market's saying, well, the real rate of return should be 2% and inflation is 3%, the yield's going to be 5%. So what happened is that people felt that that premium for real rate of return would come down, but that inflation would come down, so interest rates would come down, especially the 10-year rate, because the 10-year rate is what mortgages are connected to. And in fact, mortgage rates historically have been somewhere about 180 basis points above the 10-year Treasury rate. Right now, they're almost 220 basis points above the 10-year Treasury rate, which is why mortgage rates are so high. What has happened um, when Trump first took office, the stock market took off, but so did interest rates. And it's very unusual that they both did well at the same time. And what happened was that people started to realize that, geez, maybe we're not done with inflation, that a lot of inflation that's left has to do not with commodity prices as much with as with home prices, which are a major component of the CPI and the deflator for personal consumption expenditures, which is what less food and energy, which is what the Fed tends to look at when it makes its decision. And because people are now so uncertain over Trump's policies and the fact that inflation is higher than expected, and that especially that the jobs market was particularly strong, that they're saying, geez, that premium over inflation has to be higher too because of all the uncertainty. So rates have gone up. That makes it difficult for guys who want to buy and gals who want to buy a home or refinance their mortgage. It makes it difficult for most countries to finance. It makes it more expensive, and their markets might not be deep enough. We're lucky here in the U.S. and that the linchpin of the whole bond market throughout the world is treasury bills, American treasury bills of various maturities, and it makes it more difficult for corporations to finance their debt. So it's dicey at the moment. Which way things are going to go? The newspapers tend to look at futures markets to try to determine which way interest rates are going to go. Those futures markets have been historically fairly inaccurate. And I think that's the case now. Because of Trump's situation where nobody knows exactly how things are going to play out with all his different policies that, if taken at face value, don't fit together, again, it creates uncertainty. So you now have 10-year treasuries at the highest level in 20 years. You have mortgage rates at the highest level in 20 years. You have this huge federal deficit. We've had an expansion for years, and employment's been good for years. Yet the deficit is now 6.5%. Every year, the debt is growing by 6.5%, and that's crazy. Trump's goal is to get it down to 3%. I think that's going to be difficult at best. It's possible, depending on what Trump and Ramaswamy end up doing, but basically it's going to be difficult. So that is, I think, why you're starting to see the stock market, which is expensive by most measures, start to get a little dicey as well. So in effect, it's a difficult time. Things will play out one way or the other as you see what gets through Congress with Trump's policies. It's anybody who says they know exactly what's going on at the present time is lying to you, because they just don't. It's impossible to know. The general consensus is the economy is going to continue to grow, that interest rates will start to come down, but not nearly as much, that the 3% mortgage rates we saw 2 and 3 years ago were as much an aberration as the 12% mortgage rates we saw in 1982, and that interest rates will come down, but the day of essentially almost free money is over.
So help me understand how the decision to raise or lower rates is made. Most people, I think, understand the stock market is done through a distributed model where they have a series of stocks that they've selected that will help determine whether the Dow is going up or down. My belief would be that first, the information that we talked about, it's going to be based upon what the feds are doing. It's also going to be based upon the amount of debt that the federal government is taking on, how they're speculating on whether or not Donald Trump's policies will be inflationary or not. But what's the actual process? Is it just a marketplace where people are buying and selling and it incrementally moves up or down in one direction?
Short-term rates, very short-term rates are set by the Federal Reserve. If they think the economy is weakening, they will lower rates. If they think the economy is too hot, they will raise rates in order to slow the economy. There's an argument, by the way, that the Fed left rates too low too long and then basically raised them to, started to raise them and perhaps left that higher rate for too long, but that's neither here nor there. It's short-term interest rates are set by the Fed based on whether they want to slow the economy or they want the economy to basically speed up and be stronger. Intermediate and long-term rates are set by basically the public market. It's what people are thinking about, and what they're saying now is that inflation is not getting back to 2%. That's clearly what it's saying, and we'll see if they're right or wrong. But it's like any market. There are thousands, perhaps millions of buyers and sellers every day that set that price, and it's the average of that expectation which is what you're seeing in the price. There's always some people who say, well, yeah, this is a rate that will cover what my expectations, so I'm going to buy now. There are others who will say, no, rates have to be higher, so I'll wait, or I'm not going to invest my money today, or I'll keep it short term so I can reinvest it in a couple of months when the 90-day Treasury bill that I bought matures. So it really is set by the open market for anything but very short term.
So in general, the long-term rate tends to follow what the Federal Reserve is doing, at least historically. This is an anomaly in that they're breaking from the feds. My question to you is that a worry in itself? Or is there a worry that maybe the market no longer has faith in the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think the market is reacting to the Fed, which thought it was going to cut rates by about 25 basis points every month going forward for a while. That's gone. Now the expectation is, the hope is, they don't raise rates. So that's saying that the Fed is now saying the economy is not weak enough to cut rates. The economy is still strong, and that's going to leave rates higher for longer. And people are reacting to that. And so I don't think that they're going the opposite way of the Fed. There is this huge uncertainty as to how things are going to play out. And part of it is the economy being stronger than expected. And part of it is that Trump's policies have yet to play out. I think 6 months from now, you probably have a much better idea. But the other thing that isn't happening is inflation seems to be stuck at in the threes, and basically until you're not going to see inflation rates come down until housing prices come down, and that just doesn't seem to be in the cards at the moment, because it's not commodity prices at this point that's causing inflation. It's out and out housing prices, and that's the thing that really is hurting at the moment.
I believe that what we're seeing is a reaction to inflation getting stuck at about 2.5% to 3%, and it's been stuck for a while. And the Fed is not reacting to that. It remains, it's holding its cutting steady to where it currently is. It is reducing the extent to which it is unwinding the quantitative expansion that it engaged in, where the Fed's reserve increased from a little under $1 trillion to well over $7 trillion. It bought up huge amounts of mortgage-backed securities and even treasuries, in essence, monetizing deficit spending. So you aren't seeing them moving aggressively to bring it down further. In fact, they're looking to cut. So I think it's a combination of concern about inflation and uncertainty about the health of the federal government's financing. It's a huge borrower, and there's no indication that it's not going to continue to borrow hugely, which distorts and if it's not monetized by the Fed, it has the effect of crowding out borrowing by private borrowers and increasing the price of private borrowers to borrow. So I think it's a combination of lack of confidence about continuing to reduce inflation and uncertainty over the health of the federal fisc.
So last week in our show, Bob, you made some comments about Trump's policies and the what may be longer term benefits that he would have to go through short term pain on. It's fascinating to me because I think that the tariffs certainly could end up having a counter effect to what's going on in regulations, both long term and short term. So the tariffs may have there may be some long-term benefit to them. I'm not one that tends to buy into that. I like more of a free market. But if there is a long-term benefit, it will come with short-term pain. But it seems to me that will be more extractive to the economy. It would do more to slow the economy down, whereas the reduction in regulations, if he's actually successful at that, could actually speed the economy up. I was looking at some numbers the other day, and I found them to be fascinating. I think it was about $1.2 trillion in actual cost to the economy was added by Obama regulations, another $35 billion added by Trump, and then somewhere about $1.3 trillion added on top of that by Biden in regulations. And if you looked at it in man hours, it was like Biden, I'm going to have this a little off, but Obama was like 260 million man hours of regulatory forms and hours. In hours, it would have to be filled out in regulatory forms. Trump was in like 60 million, and then Biden was back up at 260 million. But if you actually could reduce regulations, there's some easing that I would think that would happen that would allow us to grow the economy faster. Do you think that Elliot spoke about how there's unease about what these new policies are going to mean by Trump? Do you agree with that? Do you think that the unease about Trump's policies and the effect that they're going to have is having some effect on the bond markets and concerns about inflation?
Yeah, I think it's uncertainties, not necessarily if you equate the two, but
Okay.
uncertainty.
I think it's both uncertainty and one of the things that is certain is that Trump regards himself as tariff man. And it's highly unlikely that we're not going to have some of these threats actually be imposed. And that will, to a certain extent, in the short term, increase prices. But he seems to make a new tariff threat every day for some other country for some other reason. And that does create uncertainty, and uncertainty increases the price of borrowing. So I think that is an element of it. But I think it's more at present driven by the fundamentals of concern about the ability to continue to bring down inflation and the fact that the federal government appears to be completely unserious about fixing its finances and reducing the huge amount of money that it itself seeks to borrow in these same markets where private borrowers are trying to borrow.
Well, that's the great unknown. Everything Trump wants to do, and that's why I'm not sure how tariffs fit in, but everything else would be pro-growth. And if he uses tariffs correctly, it might not hurt that much, but it remains to be seen what he does. But every one of his other policies is pro-growth. And so I think the economy will grow more rapidly than it otherwise would have. But clearly, the only way he's going to make headway in terms of the deficit is to address regulation and cut the costs of that the average person is taxed on, or is the part of taxes that go for regulation and the part of prices that go for regulation. And so unless they can cut a substantial amount of money, I agree with Bob that inflation will not come down. Quite frankly, I don't see how it comes down much below 3% anyway at this point, mainly because in the CPI, about almost a third is housing. And in the personal consumption expenditure index, it's about 16% that's housing. Given the shortage of housing and increasing prices and increasing costs of building a house, largely regulatory, we're stuck.
All right, so let's shift over to the big news this week, which was the California fire. There were, I was again looking at some of the numbers last week. Chase did an estimate where they thought at the time there was about $50 billion worth of damage, with only about $20 billion of it being insured. The estimates this week is that we may be actually exceeding $150 billion in total damage. It's horrendous. 180,000 people have been displaced. The death toll continues to grow. It's having both political consequences as well as having economic consequences. Before we kind of get into it, though, the question I want to ask you, Bob, is that I've been struggling as I'm listening to the media on this issue, and here's why. When we had the hurricane 6 months ago, if you were to listen to the liberal media, the only thing you would have heard, it sounded like MAGA was responsible for the hurricanes. This week, if you listen to the conservative media, it's like lesbians caused the fires in California. And neither one of those seemed to make sense to me. And unfortunately, what I think ends up being missed is a real discussion about serious policy issues that really do exist in both cases, not to be critical of either governor, not to be focused on how do you change the governor, but instead, how do you address these policy issues? So I want to start with asking you about the fire, but I'd also like to ask you for maybe some guidance on how do we get information on those types of issue in a media that's so divisive today, where everything is filtered through a political lens.
Certainly, when you have a catastrophe like this, the politicians will try to point fingers and assess blame and to take advantage of the catastrophe for their own political agendas and futures. And what they say is newsworthy. You can't really blame reporters for reporting what leading officials say during a time like this. I think that it's, if one simply views from responsible media, and that may be a declining share of the overall media, what they report about what's actually happening, you can piece together a reasonably accurate view of what's going on. In this particular case, it's complicated. I think that I would agree with those who say that California, for the most part, is misgoverned. And undoubtedly, there were, because of the priorities that the politicians made, a shortchanging of things that might help in combating a catastrophe of this size. And even though I'm nowhere close to even largely knowledgeable, much less an expert, it does strike me, or at least my impression from what I have gathered, is that this is a catastrophe that would have overwhelmed any reasonable preparation that anyone would have made in advance. So you just got to kind of shift through the claims of the politicians, season it with factual reporting of what's actually happening, and then develop a mosaic of a understanding of your sense of what's happened. And for me, that mosaic is that this was a catastrophe that would have overwhelmed even more serious efforts to prepare in advance for these kind of wildfires.
Yeah, I think politically it's going to have an effect. Again, back to the media, there was a huge criticism going on about the DEI issue over the fire chief who was a female. Now, as it turns out, this woman has been through almost every single department. She seems not only eminently qualified. Of the top 2,500 candidates, she scored 50th. She did very well in her programming. She's gay. She is a female. But she's fire chief, and I am not a supporter of DEI. I think DEI is a huge problem. But I think every time that something goes wrong, that you blame it on a woman in charge is not going to be helpful to the cause of trying to change DEI. At the same time, what I noticed in the media is that the minute she was critical of Mayor Bass, and Mayor Bass seems to be deserving of the criticism, she all of a sudden became a darling of the Fox News and Republican media. So that shift to me was fairly clear. Now, Mayor Bass has her own set of problems. She promised not to go out of state during her campaign. She obviously was in, I think, Guyana during the fire. She left before the fire. She didn't leave during the fire. And she was given some position where she ended up getting to go to an inauguration that seemed to be important to her. But she's done other trips. And then the real problem, of course, was when she was asked as she got off of the plane what was going on. She just went through a pregnant pause that looks like she was absent of any ability to deal with this. On the other hand, Gavin Newsom, who's taking a lot of criticism. If I've learned anything, I didn't believe this until I watched him debate DeSantis. That guy's a survivor. My guess is he figures out a way to work his way through this and still be a potential presidential nominee. But I do think that it's fair to say that there's some unfair things being leveled at the elected officials, like preparedness. I'm not quite sure that they could have been prepared for 100-mile-an-hour winds and softball-type embers that were flying into homes. I think there are some things that are problematic for them long-term, like insurance regulations that are going to stop people from insuring inside the state. I think there are other issues in the state as well. But how do you, when you try to weigh that out politically, is your view that there are some mistakes that are being made that could be that are problematic, that are now noticeable from the fire?
I think certainly there is now a litany of things that could have been done, and priorities were spent elsewhere. I don't know that if those other things had been done, that it would have made a meaningful difference to the outcome. But I do believe that this event will accelerate what was already a political trend, including in California, which is to get greater emphasis to government being competent at core functions, providing public safety, protecting to the extent you can against these kind of catastrophic events, and de-emphasizing, even among a liberal electorate, more of the subsidization, income redistribution, climate change, other what could be considered political luxury goods from a liberal standpoint. I think that there is, even in California, an ongoing trend towards creating or putting greater value on competency in core delivery of government services to the general electorate and the core functions of government, which there's a sense that have been neglected. And this particular catastrophe, I think, will accentuate and accelerate that political movement, which I think was already taking some degree of root.
Yeah, California has a large series of problems that were evident before this fire, namely their regulatory environment, and that's just evident in the amount of companies that are looking at moving out, and companies that I've been involved with working with that have been interested in the Arizona market, namely because of regulations. Elliot, I want to ask you about the insurance question. So, what happened both in Florida and has happened in California is that as insurance rates have continued to rise, there have been populist movements put into place to try to restrict the insurance companies from being able to assess the risk accurately. Their view is that they want to try to spread that risk out all over the state. They don't want them to be able to pick out certain sections of the state that may run a higher risk, either from hurricanes or from fires. But one of the arguments against that is, in effect, that's a subsidy of real estate that may be in a more problematic area. Palisades is probably one of the key places to note that. What's your thought about how the states have been dealing with the insurance issue and actually allowing the real risk to be assessed accurately?
Well, this is one of the many problems that Bob talked about, including the dams, the water, the not having fireproof electric lines, the fact that they've reduced the budget of things that would have mitigated. We'll never know what would have happened, but clearly the reduction in budgets for the fire department and mitigation of major fires by controlling the dry forest never happened. A lot of it never happened, but the one of the worst ones was insurance. In its ultimate wisdom, the regulatory people in California allow insurance companies to charge $1, and this is before the fire. So imagine what it's going to be after. They were allowed to charge $1 for every $1.09 they paid out in claims. So every time they wrote a policy, they knew they were going to have about a 10% loss. On top of that to me means they're about 25% too low, and that was before this fire. The risks, perceived risks, for the rest of the state, especially Southern California, have escalated dramatically now. And so it makes sense that insurance companies pulled out of that state. It's the only logical conclusion you can draw. And the regulatory people have simply been lucky. They've been playing Russian roulette. It was just a matter of time till they got the chamber with the bullet in it. And now they have. Will it have the positive effect that Bob is suggesting? I would hope so. Common sense would tell you so. However, if you take a look at Newsom's recent budget, he continues to cut things that would have mitigated this fire and spend the money on, use the expression, bullshit. He has no priorities, just no priorities whatsoever. In fact, I like his latest claim is this was due to hydrocarbon whiplash. And in other words, it's all the environment. Well, if you go back and you take a look at records of dry seasons and warm seasons, this is not much different than the 2010s and 20s, and there was no global warming back then. But getting back to insurance, you're exactly right. You are subsidizing bad behavior. We did so in Louisiana when people were building below the water level behind dikes that really wouldn't work under all circumstances. You are doing the same when you basically, that's why they had to pool insurance for earthquakes in California, because there are a lot of places in California people shouldn't be living. Might not happen for 100 or 1,000 years, but you don't know. There's a lot of chambers in that gun, but it's still Russian roulette. Now you have Biden in one of the things he mentioned a few weeks ago. few days ago actually, was that the federal government would bear those costs. In other words, everybody in the country is going to end up paying for those people who lived in a place where there was fire danger and for whatever reason did not fully insure themselves. What you're doing is preventing the market from understanding the full costs of what they should be paying for living in this area. And if they want to pay those costs, God bless them. But I got to tell you, they shouldn't ask people in Arizona or Connecticut or Iowa to bear the costs of their bad decisions.
Again, to me, it becomes a subsidy of real estate. So there's no way if you don't have fire insurance, it becomes very difficult to be able to sell a home because the next guy can't refinance it and get a loan without fire insurance. So the cost of the insurance has a direct effect on your ability to sell the home. Now, the way that can be offset is you can lower the value of the home itself. One way to fix that is to spread that cost out over a larger area. But what that means is that the people who are living maybe in the poorer areas of Los Angeles are paying a higher premium on a percentage basis to cover the people who live in the wealthier areas in Palisade. There's all types of consequences here that just don't make sense. And not allowing the insurance company to properly assess the risk, I think, is the beginning point of having to think about, well, who's going to pay for this loss? Because it's either going to end up being the homeowner or the next homeowner. It's going to be the insurance company, or it's going to be society in general. And again, as you take those risks away from as you begin to mitigate those risks that exist in areas where they are higher problems, you are going to effectively, sooner or later, going to have to pay the piper. There are some areas where I think that the city and state have done a poor job. And my guess is, by the way, I agree with both of you on this. I've watched in city governments, police and fire are the two fundamental things that cities were formed for. And in the beginning, fires were a much bigger risk than public safety was. Effectively, there were massive fires that happened in all types of cities all over the country. And to mitigate those risks, we put together fire departments and fire standards. And those fire standards improve over the years. We learn more things about how to reduce the risk of fire. But one of the things that's happened in California is there's a very, very strong NIMBY movement. And that NIMBY movement wants to do everything it can to keep people from building new homes, adding additions to their existing homes, doing anything that create any type of changes. And so they've created a very difficult regulatory environment to stop that from happening. Well, outside the incorporated areas of LA, the estimates are right now about 90% of the homes were built before 1970 and 50% were built in the 1950s. The new homes that are being built actually did a much better job of withstanding the fire because of the fire standards that were added. One of the adverse consequences of NIMBYism is that it actually has an effect on aging the overall housing stock.
Well, I think you're correct, and it reflects in a lot of ways. Among those ways is the cost of housing in California. You can't build affordable housing. It takes years and years to get a project through, which would suggest that the project price has to be higher to pay for all the money that's out for a long period of time. It's risky, and they do everything possible regulatory-wise to make it very, very difficult to bring new housing onto the market that is sorely needed, especially in California. The result is not only do you have very, very high prices, but let's take nationally, about 65% of all homeowners or of all people live in single-family homes, whereas only 35% live in apartments. In California, it's almost 50-50 because so many fewer people can afford a house. And that's true even though prices are much higher for both housing and for apartments. So to me, you're absolutely right that essentially the only way to deal with this problem is to Well, let me digress a second. You're the politician, okay? But it strikes me that it's very easy that the old story that costs are that costs are specific and benefits are diffused. So whenever there's somebody like, they're going to put this new apartment down the street, or this new subdivision, and it's going to block my view, or it's going to create more traffic, it's easy to get a base. So when you go to a city council meeting, there are 50, 60, 100 people opposing it. The developer, he's not going to get neighbors to come out. Maybe he'll get a few, but most city councils are overwhelmed with the negative side, and therefore being elected officials are much more likely to look at that negative side than the positive side. I see that in Arizona. I see it everywhere. I see it, and
You're exactly right on
and
this.
I see it in the city of Phoenix. And so I don't know that there's an answer for it, especially in a place like California, because we can't even deal with it in Arizona. Scottsdale just lost a major employer because of some guys who's decided that major development shouldn't occur at essentially the corner of two freeways. Oh, well, what better place is there? But that's neither here nor there. I think that, and as you know, we were both part of a group called Home Arizona, trying to get city council people to understand the basic need, the basic fact that their most important people, the first responders, couldn't live in their community because they couldn't afford housing in their community, and we got nowhere.
Yeah.
In my,
I do believe that understanding the consequences are important. There's an old saying by an economist, it might have been Milton Friedman, who said, "You show me the incentive, I'll show you the result."
right.
Well, just look at the incentive. Here's the incentive today. If you decide to build, I'll just pick out the Phoenix metro area because I think that that's one that I know very well, but this is going to be true all over the country. If you decide to build in the urban area, you pick out an urban area like Scottsdale, Tempe, or Phoenix, you are 2 to 2.5 years of going through the entitlement process before you're putting up the first stick. If you go to the far outlying reaches of the county, you can end up getting a permit 6 to 8 months from now. Well, there's your first incentive, right? The idea that you can be quicker into the marketplace says go further and further out. Now, we do a traffic study and we say, well, look at the traffic this high density project's going to create inside your neighborhood. Well, developers don't create people. That is a misnomer. They do not create people. People are created by birth rates, they're created by immigration policy, they're created by a whole series of other things. All the developer does is help decide where they're going to be located. So if you have employment that's in the inner city and you have housing that's in the outlying area and you have people that have to drive back and forth, you haven't decreased any traffic, you've just spread it out over a larger area. And then let's go back to this housing stock issue. If you take housing stock in the inner city, oftentimes developers will come in and they'll say, hey, I want to do an assemblage and I'm going to go in and tear down some older properties and I'm going to build something new. It's generally going to be a more high density project. But if you decide we don't want high density projects, then you're also going to live with an older housing stock. And over time, that creates its own set of problems in a variety of different ways. Here's the thing. If you're not changing and improving, you're not getting better, you're getting worse. That's just true from an urban standpoint. But everybody wants to look at it and say, well, look at the profit of the developer. Look, the developer, if people need homes, they're still going to find a place to put them. It's just they're not going to put them in the inner city. They're going to move them someplace else. And trying to get people's head wrapped around that idea of understanding it is important. Even the homeless issue. We had a speaker at one of our book clubs that came out, and I thought he did a great job, but he did an analysis around the country. He said, look, if you want to know where homeless problems exist, where housing has the hardest time from a regulatory standpoint to be built. Because the more difficult it is to build housing, the less houses there are. The less houses they are has a downward effect, and the people at the bottom end up suffering the most from it.
I absolutely agree with you about housing. And again, because it's so much of the consumer price index, until you start to get more housing, so supply and demand can start to equal each other, prices are going to continue to rise, and that's what's preventing what the Fed wants, which is 2% inflation. We'll see what happens, but I agree with you that both of you that for housing it's difficult, and for California we'll never know what the exact problem was, and we'll never know exactly what things would have looked like otherwise. But it's clear that California has done everything it can to make things worse. And you talk about incentives, the dams, the lack of water, the electric poles that basically burn down, insurance rates, not providing enough to both the fire department or the entities that mitigate fire. All these things have to be looked at. There will again never know exactly what things otherwise would have looked like, but hopefully you're right, and it moves things back to more common sense spending. Again, the purpose of government, if you read the Constitution, is to protect me, protect my home, and protect my private property. That's really the basic purpose of government. And if it's not doing that, I don't know why they have a government.
All right, Bob, immigration. You wrote a great column this week, actually today, on immigration. If you would, talk a little bit about that article. And specifically, one of the things that fascinated me about it was the political shifts that are actually taking place amongst how the Democratic Party seems to be approaching immigration today.
Immigration reform for decades now has been stalled out by a political standoff between Republicans and Democrats, neither of whom ever developed enough political position in Congress to override the other, in which Democrats would not consider stronger, better immigration law enforcement unless it was accompanied by some broad grant of legalization for those who are currently in the country illegally. And Republicans would insist that immigration reform, better enforcement, had to precede any discussion of legalization. And there was ample reason to believe that they would never seriously be willing to have that discussion about a broad grant of amnesty, irrespective of how strong immigration enforcement came. I happen to believe in both stronger immigration enforcement, not holding it hostage to a broad grant of amnesty, but also I support a broad grant of amnesty and believe that we can do so in a way that wouldn't create the incentive for additional illegal immigration going forward. The major political shift that has occurred is that Democrats are no longer holding better immigration enforcement hostage to a broad grant of amnesty to those who are currently in the country illegally. The first indication of that occurred actually before the election, when Democrats were willing to support asylum reform, trying to close off questionable asylum claims that then were a ticket to admit someone to the country for at least several years, including getting a work permit. They were willing to tighten that up without any additional legalization for those who are currently in the country illegally. The stronger signal is that Democrats are giving a pass, not filibustering. The most recent immigration bill that is moving through Congress, the Lincoln-Riley Act, and the immigration rights groups kicked up only a minor fuss over the asylum reform bill, they're kicking up a huge fuss over the Laken Riley Act. And despite them kicking up a huge fuss, the Democrats didn't filibuster it, and there's enough Democratic support that something in its orbit is likely to become law. And the act has been misconstrued and misrepresented by both proponents and opponents. It's actually a fairly modest measure with respect to its immigration component. And it says that illegal immigrants who are charged with property crimes, theft, burglary, larceny, shoplifting are the enumerated crimes, would be subject to a immigration detainer, and would, if custody can be transferred, and that's a big issue, would be detained and then subject to deportation. So the Democrats are being accused by the immigration rights group and those on the left of punishing people for low property crimes without due process. And that's not at all what's going on. They aren't being detained because of the property crimes that they are being charged with. They're being detained for violating our immigration laws. And the violation simply has surfaced in the context of the crimes for which they've been charged. And they're not going to be denied due process. If their criminal case goes forward, every element of due process will be afforded them. There are due process provisions in our immigration laws with respect to deportation. If they are subject to deportation, they will have full advantage of that. So this is simply Democrats saying we're willing in these circumstances not to turn a blind eye to the immigration offense. And that has been the position of the party. Now, I actually think that this is good for the long-term goal, which I share, of providing legal status for most of those who are currently in the country illegally. Bill Buckley once observed about our drug laws that the quickest way to get them reformed, and he wanted them reformed in a libertarian direction, was to universally enforce them. And I think that may also be true of our immigration laws. There are millions of people, including millions of kids, who are part of blended immediate families, where you have some members of the family who are here legally and some members of the family who are not. And overwhelmingly, those who are currently in the country illegally have been here for many years and have settled into productive lives, created a productive life for themselves and a contributing life to the rest of society while here. And while one of the lessons from the election was that the public body politic no longer wanted a blind eye turned to illegal immigration. They wanted something done about it. I don't think there is support for broad scale breaking up of families and wholesale deportation of those who have created productive lives in this country, even though they're here illegally. So paradoxically, I think by stepping back from fighting immigration enforcement measures, I think that Democrats actually hasten the day when we can have a discussion of how do we prevent immigration on an ongoing, illegal immigration on an ongoing basis, which I think is a combination of mandatory use of E-Verify to electronically confirm eligibility for work in new hires, and asylum reform. So questionable asylum claims can't result in being admitted to the country for several years, including getting a work permit. If you can do those things, I think you can grant a broad amnesty without a fear and concern about it being an invitation to additional illegal immigration going forward and the need for another amnesty in the future. So I think the Democrats that are being castigated for support for this particular measure are being unfairly and inaccurately criticized. And I actually think paradoxically it can help clear the policy issues involved and make the day where we can seriously discuss a general amnesty for most of the illegal population occur sooner than otherwise would be the case, getting out of the stalemate.
How does the new act differ from existing law?
There is, all illegal immigrants are subject to detention and deportation. It just rarely occurs because, except around the border area, we don't try to locate illegal immigrants, and we don't have much of a detention capacity. So there is in federal law some mandates that in these circumstances, detention has to occur. And for the most part right now, it's violent offenses. So this expands that to those property crimes that are enumerated in this particular act. It will still have limited effect because effectively transferring custody to immigration officials requires a high degree of cooperation by local law enforcement, both in ascertaining that the person who's been arrested is indeed illegally here, and in honoring the detainer request by the immigration officials to not release the person and instead turn them over to immigration for detention. Now, there are a large number of so-called sanctuary cities throughout the country that have declared that they are unwilling to cooperate with the federal government in these two respects of helping out enforcing our immigration laws. So in much of the country, this act by itself will have limited effect. And there's nothing in the act which compels that kind of cooperation by local law enforcement. My anticipation is that sometime moving forward, as part of additional immigration law reform, that compulsion will be advanced by Republicans. But at present, it will have limited effects in many parts of the country, but will expand the category of offenses for which the Department of Homeland Security is obligated under law to seek a detainer and to detain the person after whatever custody hold is in place for the property crimes for which they are charged.
My own personal opinion, as we've done on the show in the past, I've been a supporter of a merit-based immigration policy for our country. I also am a supporter of, at least in concept, the HB1 visa program. I do think trying to attract the best talent from around the world here is something that makes sense to us. But it seems as though that what happens in immigration is all of this stuff gets put into one big pool. And I like the point that Bob is making on this, is that as it's put into one big pool, it kind of adds to the political boil of putting the dreamers into the same pile as someone who's committed some type of property crime. This law, by allowing, by creating a separation and allowing the deportation of people who have been involved in the crime, maybe helps lower that temperature somewhat, so that there's an ability to deal with it more of a merit-based system on the back end.
Two things. First, as you said earlier, show me incentive, I'll show you the result. With households with an average of average working age, the bottom of illegals, basically the bottom 20% receive $65,000 in government benefits. that is it says two things. It says, don't work, but show up. Okay. We need more than anybody realizes. We need more people. We need more people who are qualified along all the entire spectrum of employment. Anything from PhDs down to somebody who can work in the service industry. We need people. We have to, or we're going to have to import them. We're lucky because we're one of the few places in the world that people really want to go. So we have to recognize that as a fact of life. Given that, we basically have to import people, but those people, A, as Bob said, should be here because they want to work and they will work. B, they shouldn't be heavily subsidized in terms of welfare because they're here to work. And if you're not working, you shouldn't be here. And that's the reality. And I believe that when you're talking about the amnesty, that's heavily overused, and I absolutely agree with what Bob said about it. But everything he said, I agree with, except people never talk about how much we're going to need people. That we don't have the population base or the birth rate to maintain any meaningful growth out into the future. And so the question is, how do you get people who are going to work? And my suggestion is you do away with welfare benefits for those people who come to this country but don't want to work or spend an extended period of time unemployed. Because if you're not employed in today's world, you don't want to work.
This fight that's happening between the America Firsters and the tech bros is accelerating, and where we're really seeing it going this week was Steve Bannon really has been lighting up Elon Musk. They see him as being almost an anathema to the MAGA movement. I'd love to just have your thoughts on that battle that's taking place, only as it relates to immigration. Is your view more that immigration is a problem across the board, or that we should be more selective in terms of who we're trying to export? Certainly, we're trying to stop immigration at the border, but this whole deportation program that we're talking about increasingly as the Trump administration is coming into play is going to be interesting to see who we actually do deport and what effect that starts to have on a variety of different labor pools.
I think the fight between Bannon and Musk is extraordinarily entertaining, but ultimately not particularly important. As we discussed, I think, on a prior episode, these high-tech visas that has created this dispute and this blood feud between Bannon and Musk isn't all that important to the grassroots activists that are an important part of Trump's winning coalition, and not central to their concern about immigration. There's a limited number of them. There's only about 85,000 that are granted each year. And what is animating concern about immigration as a political force is the illegal immigration, not the legal immigration for the high-tech folks. So this is kind of a battle between titans at the top of the MAGA movement that is not particularly central to the concerns of the grassroots activists that are actually the important part of Trump's agenda. The larger challenge for Trump is one that you alluded to. He has said there's going to be massive deportation of the people that we described, many of whom are in blended families, most of whom have been here for many years and have settled productive lives in this country. If he retreats from that, then there will be disappointment among that grassroots force that propelled him into power. But actually doing that requires vast resources that a broke federal government doesn't have, and will then start generating these poignant stories of families being broken up and people who have settled into productive lives here being deported. And you saw what happened when Trump engaged in the family separation program. It created a huge backlash. It was stopped by the courts, but my guess is that he would have retreated politically because he doesn't withstand that kind of backlash very far. So I do believe that there is going to be tension within the anti-immigration element of MAGA, and that it's going to be difficult for the Trump administration to navigate the expectations that have been created. But I don't think this fight of the Titans at the top is anything other than kind of entertaining. And I think Bannon is probably wasting his time, because I think Musk is inevitably going to blow himself up before anyone else, including Steve Bannon, can take him out. But I must say that it is rich political entertainment to watch it occurring.
To me, watching the fight between Democrats and Republicans anymore almost isn't as interesting as the fight between what's going on internally in the Republican Party. And the reason that it's more interesting to me is because I think it's more consequential. I think the winner of that, who Trump kind of ends up siding with philosophically as opposed to the individuals, is going to be an important part of what he leaves behind as a legacy. Is this going to be about cutting regulations, cutting the size of government, or is this going to be a vendetta for the people who feel like they've been left out of the system? And there is some melding that can take place in that, but the two sides right now aren't into melding. They have very different points of view, and they see the other side as the enemy. All right, so let's go to this last issue. I don't know if any of you saw Joe Rogan this week, but he did a great job of interviewing Mark Zuckerberg. Mark has come out with this change policy of saying that he's going to get rid of the fact checkers, which is fascinating to me, which is part of why I listened to the interviews, because I was pretty sure that if Kamala Harris would have won, he wouldn't have changed the policy in the direction that he changed it in. But I think there are some fair points that are being made about what's happening from a free speech standpoint inside of places like Facebook. By the way, one of the fascinating things that I learned about Facebook is that he said that he has, I think it was 3.5 billion listeners, or excuse me, people who are on one of his platforms every day. Monthly, half of the planet takes part in one of his platforms. I mean, it's a massive mega site that is including lots of different people. And while I've actually been on the side of saying, no, I think they should be liable for information that's wrong. Listening to his explanation, I think, had an effect on how I saw it. His point was, look, if I decide to enforce information being correct and truthful, and I decide to do that at a 90% level, he said there are a certain amount of innocent people that are going to end up being thrown off of the system just because it's impossible not to. But if I go to a 99% level, he said that number goes up dramatically. And he said it's just not possible for me to have every one of these individuals being reviewed. All I can do is create algorithms that help that. Although he also pointed out that the fact checkers were much more liberal, so I was having a difficult time trying to understand how the algorithm meshed with more liberal fact checkers. But nonetheless, he said they came out of California and he was looking at moving that to Texas. The other thing that he talked about was the masculinity issue, which to me just adds to Mark Zuckerberg's problem of, I don't really know who he is. I mean, with Elon Musk, I like Elon Musk. I think there are a number of things he's doing that challenge me and that I'm not happy with. But I think Elon Musk has kind of a there. I'm not sure about that with Mark Zuckerberg. He just seems to kind of change with the wind. I didn't feel clear when I was done he was doing what he was doing from a moral standpoint. But I do buy into the idea that at the end of the day, we want to try to allow as many people to be able to participate as possible. And even though I'll go to our Twitter feed or go to our Facebook feed and see sometimes very horrible anti-Semitic, racist comments that will come through, my guess is at the end of the day, if that's the comments that they want to make, they make their own point because the other people who read them end up being turned off by it. But Bob, you've been deplatformed on Facebook, so I'd love to have kind of your thoughts. I'm not sure what nasty thing you were saying that caused that to happen, but maybe you can enlighten us with it.
Well, actually, I can't because you can't really engage with Facebook as to their reasons. But yes, my content has been blocked on Facebook for several years now. Originally, they told me that they had decided I was spam because I had lots of followers, but I wasn't friends. I just used it as a place to disseminate my column. Subsequently, the block message said that there had been complaints that my content violated community standards. I haven't tried since Zuckerberg made his announcement that he was ceasing that kind of behavior, but I have been banned by Facebook. When you do that, they ask you to check a mark if you disagree with the decision. I did that twice. They don't provide any space for you actually to explain why you disagree, and no one from Facebook ever contacted me. And I ultimately concluded that it was actually more valuable for my reputation, particularly in conservative circles that are sometimes suspicious of me, to have been banned by Facebook. And so I really didn't pursue it very aggressively, and I haven't checked to see whether I'm still banned or not. My instincts, Paul, are similar to yours. I believe that content moderation is a slippery slope, and it's impossible to do it well. And I also believe that if it is done aggressively by these social media companies, that they then become publishers. If they are aggressively deciding what to put out there and what not to put out there, they're publishers, and should be subject to the same liability and laws and slander and libel laws as any other publisher. And as your statistics illustrate, that simply isn't doable in these broad-based social media platforms. So I think both in terms of providing outlets for free speech, not banning people like me, and not becoming a publisher, that making them pretty much Wild West territory where anything goes is the most sensible and appropriate course of action, even though it does lead to large cesspools in social media. But I think that's, to paraphrase Churchill about democracy, that's the best alternative compared to all the others.
Again, what I find fascinating in this debate is one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg said was that if you look at the issue of terrorism as an example, he said there's very little traffic that relates to terrorism, but they've actually been able to isolate it. They've been able to isolate it, to focus on them, and almost any comment that comes across that looks like it's a threat to the United States, they're able to actually not only do something about it, but to move into other accounts that they have. They start moving into their text messages, into WhatsApp, into a variety of other things. He said, we really can't and shouldn't do that on hate speech. He said, but hate speech oftentimes is defined by the listener. As an example, I mean, I've read every column Bob's ever written, and while I haven't agreed with every column he's written, there was nothing close to hate speech that was involved in any of them. Although I could imagine that there were people who might have read them who felt personally slighted by it because of their own inclination on any issue, and they were harmed. Maybe people who listened to this immigration debate had some concerns about what they heard. The good news that I see that seems to be happening is there's a retreat that seems to be taking place on this safe space concept, that somehow or another we have to give you a safe space to be able to exist, as opposed to if you don't like something, just turning it off. We have to try to moderate the content so you don't have to even potentially hear it by accident. I also think that there have been one of the issues, and Mark talked about this. He talked about the masculinity issue, again, which I found to be fascinating. But I do think that there has been some sense of people, of young men or men, who oftentimes felt like the things that they have to say oftentimes are limited. You know, there's speech that can be obnoxious in terms of what you can say about gender and sexuality, and then there's sometimes what they call, what some people will call locker talk, and I don't quite know what the difference is. I don't know that anybody else knows what the difference is either. But they've created a limitation oftentimes on any type of speech that rests on that side. And that begins to make one group of people feel suppressed inside of our society. It seems to me the only answer we're really going to be able to come to on this is just backing away and allowing people to say the things that they want, so long as they're not physically endangering other people. But from an economic standpoint, how do you look at this? And not only an economist standpoint, you're also Jewish and been very involved in a number of Jewish issues. How do you see this meld?
Well, it's really tough. I agree with Bob that that banning it is worse than not doing anything about it. It's just it's in everybody's face every day because of the internet and the way that people receive news, which is from their phone. And it used to be you had to read a lot to get to this garbage. Now it hits you in the face every second. And but in a free society, there's a reason. Put it this way: there's a reason that free speech is the First Amendment. Okay, and in a free society, you have to put up with it. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know that anybody does. I think the Supreme Court has gone a long way to defining what free speech is. But quite frankly, if some kid at ASU doesn't like what he hears, I don't care. I really don't. It's basically incumbent upon him to do enough research to verify in his mind his position. You can't just go la 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 and make believe this stuff doesn't exist. It's going to make for a messier society because that cesspool is now in front of everybody. But like Bob, I don't know what the alternative is, and economically, I'm not sure what the impact is, quite frankly.
Yeah, from my standpoint, and I'll just make this kind of the final comment on it, unless you guys have something that you'd like to say. But there are often, if on my X feed, it ends up being a whole lot worse than on my Facebook feed. So there's no doubt Musk lightening the regulations, I think, have a much more negative effect. But at the end of the day, if I don't like it, I don't have to read it. People can post something. First, I'm posting something and people are responding to it. And maybe they're responding in a negative way. And I can either not post or I can not read the posts that come in. Those are all my choices as opposed to theirs. However, when I do read it, especially the ones that are well written and that are disagreeing with me, I always find that if I self-reflect a little bit, it actually helps me. At the end of the day, free speech is not just helpful to the people who are saying it, it's also helpful to the people who disagree with it. Because the only way we can grow is to confront and listen to people who we don't oftentimes agree with. Even if when we get done, we go, I still disagree with them, but either I understand where they're coming from or I recognize that I can live with it.
I think that's very well said. And it does seem to register an optimistic note that our society is rediscovering a lot of liberal values, including free speech, including equality of opportunity, rather than the allocation of benefits based upon identity politics, competence in the core functions of government. So I do think that there is a reaction to a lot of the things that have occurred that at least are forming the seeds of a potentially better future, more in line with our traditional values.
I always told you should run for office, Bob. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thanks, guys.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.